Great to see everybody. Fantastic. So today I am honored to welcome Tim Mohin, who has more than 40 years in sustainability across government, industry, and nonprofits. That's pretty much everything. Tim is a globally recognized ESG leader and a LinkedIn top 15 voice in the green economy. Those of you all that read his newsletters know that they're extremely valuable source of a resource for all of us. So we appreciate the time that Tim invests in that. He was the former CEO of the Global Reporting Initiative, where he led the world's leading sustainability reporting framework out of the Netherlands, actually. He was also a senior sustainability leader at Apple, Intel, and AMD, where he drove corporate ESG strategy. He was a policymaker at the EPA and the US Senate, where he shaped environmental laws, including the Clean Air Act, and then was Chief Sustainability Officer at Persephone, where he focused on carbon accounting and ESG data. Now, Tim is a partner at BCG, where he brings real-world ESG insights and battle-tested strategies and a resilience mindset, I love that, to help sustainability leaders push forward when the system feels a bit stacked against them. So again, if you have any questions for Tim as we go forward, please pop them into the chat and or raise your hand in the open Q&A session after the interview, and I will call on you to engage with Tim directly. So again, today's session is ESG's Groundhog Day, how to stay motivated amidst the shifting landscape. So I've been thinking again about this from like the fact that we were in this momentum of driving innovation, and we've now kind of, I feel, taken a step back to compliance and reporting. And we were in a strategic mentality and process. And now we're kind of back to justifying the ESG business case again. And we've moved from momentum and having an energy behind all of this to really now facing these difficult market and policy roadblocks. And so with the White House's radical policy shifts reshaping our landscape and investor scrutiny now increasing and sustainability leaders unfortunately burning out, the stakes really have never been higher. So I don't want to start off on such a negative note, but I know that the challenges are why we're here today to gather to think about how we can stay motivated and work with each other to keep our movement going. So a big welcome to Tim, and thanks again for being here and making time out of your very busy schedule for all of us.
Thank you. It's thrilling to be here. I couldn't be more excited about this discussion. It will truly be a discussion. That was a fabulous introduction. I do want to say a couple things in the beginning here. 40 years is true, which is unbelievable for me as well as everybody else. When I started, we didn't have the word sustainability. Corporate responsibility was an oxymoron. Companies were to be regulated, not to be trusted. This is a very important point because when we look at where we are today, we have to remember the sweep of time, and things have changed and largely for the better. So that's one theme I want to get into today. But it's not about me, it's about you. I think that coming out of Green Biz, we had a lot of discussions. I called it sort of a group therapy session, where there was a lot of hugging. And by the time we left, we all went out with new resolve, which was fantastic. And I want to kind of bring that into this discussion today. But before we go there, I also want to mention something about Shannon, because Shannon really pioneered the notion of coaching in this field. I think it was sort of a nascent field when you got started, Shannon, and you were one of the first to really bring executive coaching into it. And Shannon helped me into my position at GRI, and from GRI into my next position. And I can just say that she goes from the strategic to the tactical, from the emotional to the sort of hard-nosed negotiator in a second, and has all of that skill set that I just think is invaluable. But then to apply it to our particular field is even more important, I think. So I just wanted to mention that going in. We find ourselves in a really weird time. I mean, having sort of been hired in 1984 during the Reagan administration when EPA was under threat and regulations were sort of like out of style. That sounds all familiar, right? Um, we were brought in to kind of right the ship, Bill Ruckelshaus, if some of you may remember this. Um, and then, we went from regulation to voluntary action, as Shannon mentioned earlier. And I took the shift with that, leaving government to go into the private sector because, frankly, corporate actors were doing more and faster and across the world than governments could ever do. So that was an exciting time. And then we saw this sort of regulatory wave pile back up again. maybe it was like a wave. It crested really quickly, and now it seems to be crashing down around us. And that could be viewed as well, a lot of different ways, as a distraction, as we were saying, as a net positive. There's a number of ways to look at it. But if you kind of look at that sweep of time, net, it's been good. And it's been good for our profession. And our profession has never been an easy one. If you have dedicated your career towards impact, then you've already kind of made this important choice that not many people make. I remember when I first said to my then new father-in-law what I was going to do, he was like, "Are you sure you can support my daughter?" I'm like, I don't know, but this is what I want to do. A weird choice back in the 80s, right? But now it seems like a common choice. And now we're seeing roles in this space going up to the C-suite, which is why I joined BCG, frankly. BCG, McKinsey, Bain, these are the top management firms in the world. And so not having to knock on the door to get into the big table, but already being there was, to me, a major opportunity. And I am seeing that now. But I'm also seeing this change being a little bit different than the past changes, in that our field is not just being ignored, it's being weaponized. They're coming after us. And this was the conversation at Green Biz. Companies are basically very, very nervous and scared. Some of them are removing previous sustainability reports from their website because they want nothing to implicate them in the battles to come. I mean, companies naturally avoid conflict. They don't want to be part of controversy. That makes sense. But now it's getting to the point of like, what do you stand for? And that is really, I think, a test that we haven't been in before. So while we've seen the pendulum swing further and faster than previous pendulum swings, there's the difference of being kind of called out. And I think that is putting a lot of companies to the test, and we can talk about that today. But for me anyway, and coming off of Green Biz, and then Shannon and I were talking before this about some corporate encounters I've had since then, I feel very strongly that most companies are looking at their sustainability programs as a statement of their corporate values. And then they're turning around and saying, like, how did we get to those statements? Well, they all have value. And that value comes from the same four value drivers we've always had, which is investors, customers, employees, and brand. We've always had those four values, right? So the regulations sort of came, crested, and went, I don't know, but those values stayed the same. And to be honest, you probably all had this experience that I've had where, you're pulled in front of the board or the C-suite and you have to explain your value very quickly. It's always those four things. So what I'm telling companies is like, go back. I mean, certainly these times demand a review. Look at what you said then, look at the current times you're in, and, maybe there's a revision, but in many cases, it's not a wholesale washout, although we are seeing that with some companies. And so it is a different time because of this sort of targeting. But I do think that there is, if you look at this broad sweep, the trend lines that we're seeing, even some of the regulations, I think, are going to sort of continue to drive behaviors that, the profession that we all chose for the right reasons will continue to be vitally important, maybe even more important, as companies are challenged for these very values that they have stated. So that's my opening little speech, if you will. I hope it resonates. I really wanted to have more of a discussion. And by the way, I was able to kind of, keep my family afloat for the last 40 years, so it didn't turn out so bad anyway.
we all can still make a living and make a difference, right? And have an impact. And
Absolutely.
I think some people are starting to worry. Do have a lot of clients in government and a lot of funding organizations that are feeling a bit scared right now, to be honest, and I think it's a really interesting thing that you said, Tim, around we've gone from being kind of ignored to weaponized. And I do think that's this polarization that's really a scary time for everyone. I mean, you're sitting basically in one of the big consultancies at BCG. I used to be at Deloitte, as you know, and I was reading this morning about how KPMG has now followed suit of Deloitte to pull out of all things DEI, but that there's other of the big consultancies that are not following along, and other companies that aren't following along on that wave. Of course, we have the environmental issues as well, but I think the DEI one's getting a big shakedown. So I'm just curious to kind of hear from you, Tim, about your role at BCG, just to give us a little context of kind of what are you doing day to day with companies? What is it that they're wanting help with at this point? Because they're clearly still putting money towards this, or you wouldn't have a job. So just curious where you're seeing some of the trends around what the need is.
Yeah, it's a great question. Right now, like I said, everyone is running a bit scared. They don't want to be the ones targeted by the new Trump administration for quote unquote discrimination. And so, there is that factor. And so my most recent engagements have been to have those discussions about value, business value. And even here at BCG, you mentioned the consulting firms you used to work with. We've kind of rebranded a lot of this stuff because when it comes to DEI in particular, there is this false notion of somehow it flies against meritocracy, and nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, we want to have a mix of people that looks like the mix of people we serve and the mix of people around in our communities. And then we apply the basic same aligned incentives to everyone. And that could be viewed by some as good or bad, but it's true. It's how it goes, and it's not easy to meet those metrics. But when you're in a consulting firm, those are what keep you employed. And so I think it's the same with all companies. Meritocracy has been, a sort of foundational element for many years, and so a lot of companies are sort of coming to this view and maybe rebranding and something. But when you look at the headlines of companies pulling out, yes, those are there, and we're going to see boycotts tomorrow. Hopefully, you all are not going to buy anything tomorrow. And my wife will no longer shop at Target, by the way. But there are reactions to this stuff on both sides. Is the point? You really can't be a leaf in the wind. As a corporate leader, a statement of values that is backed up by business value or shared value is super important. It's not something you just willy-nilly say, well, that was then, this is now, because then what's next, and can you be trusted? And I really think that companies may be in this current sort of chaotic and somewhat troubling time overreacting. And so my message has been, take the long-term view. What you say now will have major implications for many years to come. And, perhaps you ought to really think about that. And so going back to that values statement and the business value stuff, I mean, that's what I've been counseling.
Okay, I think we're gonna have some good questions around that in a minute, but I'll come back to that. So
Tracy, you're absolutely right. As a former Apple employee, they stood up and they voted it down.
Yeah, they were one on that list in the news this morning. So yeah, I think there is still hope that some of the big tech and big government contractor leaders are gonna hold to this. So are we reverting back to a compliance focus and away from innovation? I know you're talking about value, business value and shared value, generally value creation. It does seem that it's harder for us as practitioners right now to make the business case around the investors, customers, employees, and brand when there's such this focus on compliance. But is that just a short-term kind of little blip because we've been hit with some of, the new regulatory pressures? This is obviously pre-January even, right? This is before we've been facing the rest of the fallout of the political landscape.
Yeah, so there's a couple things going on. I mean, there's the weaponization, sort of the anti-woke, let's just sort of say more culture war stuff that we've been talking about. And then there's the sort of black and white regulatory stuff. And I spent a lot of time on both, but on the regulatory side, we haven't talked about it yet. What was it, Mark? Was it Mark Twain or somebody said the rumors of our demise have been exaggerated? So when we look across the planet and we look at, let's just take one example, which is disclosure, and specifically greenhouse gas emissions and risk disclosure. We did an analysis, and this is after the SEC withdrawal, after the omnibus, which came out yesterday, and we are still seeing that about 60% of the economy from a GDP standpoint will be required mandatory disclosure of their greenhouse gas emissions and risk as part of their financials in an audited statement. So that is happening, regardless of all these headlines. The second one that it might be a little eye-opening is tariffs. We're all seeing tariffs are in, whether you love them or hate them, they're back. And one of the big moves on tariffs is carbon taxes. Europe has one, UK has one. They're popping up all over the world. Our analysis right now is that within the next few years, we'll have over 65% of world trade going through a carbon tax. Okay, that's different. That's new. So if your company is importing, exporting any of the materials that are covered, it's a big number. And so that's going to move the needle as well. And so, while we're sort of struggling to figure out if we're woke or not, these things are continuing to happen and require a change in not only thought, but management systems. Finance has to work with sustainability, has to work with legal, and we need new IT systems. And all of this stuff is happening right now inside a company. So we may not be talking about it so much anymore, but we have to do it.
So even though we're seeing kind of a lot of the loud media news in the US, it's that there's the rest of the world is going to be carrying on with prioritizing this through things like carbon tax. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Another thing I'll mention, Shannon, is that, we had this is Trump 2.0. In Trump 1.0, the same pattern existed, whereas as the US federal government pulled back, the state governments and other countries pushed forward. And so, in the US now, we have 6 states. California is not the only one that are driving climate disclosure, to use my example. And, it's quickly about a third of the GDP of the US will be requiring greenhouse gas disclosure, as a mandate. So that's happening too. So we have to just keep this all in perspective.
And that's what I was hoping you were going to bring today, which is fantastic because you have so much knowledge about what else is happening. Because I think, again, we're hearing all the bad news. That's what news is. It's always bad news. And what you're sharing today is those motivational, there's more to the story. There's more to this picture. There's more news that maybe we're not seeing as it's not as loud, right? And I was actually just, as I told you, speaking with another CSO earlier today for International Paper, Sophie, and we were saying we need a good news channel now for those kinds of snippets where we can all go and see there's hope. Look at all these good things that are happening. Let's not be reading only the negative drip feed that we're getting. So that leads me to my next question, which is, so how do we as practitioners keep pushing forward? How do we stay motivated when we feel like the system, whatever that means right now, our political landscape is working against us? What are some of, and this is maybe more of a personal question, how do we stay motivated? How do we keep pushing forward?
It's such a good question, and believe me, the emotional side is not lost on me. And I again give you a lot of credit because you listen so well, Shannon. But back, gosh, it was 2012. I wrote a book, and in the book, "Changing Business from the Inside Out" was the final title, but the original title was "A Tree Hugger's Guide to Working in Corporations." Because this is not new, okay? When I started in the field again, it was like this man bites dog story. Like, you're doing what again? And how does that add value? And you were constantly sort of threatened. I called it the corporate immune system. The white cells are trying to expel this thing from the body all the time. And so you're always called out. And it's happening to me right now at BCG. We're a very large firm, 35,000 people. We do all sorts of things, and they're like, "Well, I guess you must not be too busy now, huh?" And you're like, "Wait a minute," So there's something about our field that, one, you get into it for altruism, but two, you have to always justify your existence. So it feels like kind of unfair in a lot of ways. But I think when we talk amongst ourselves and we really look at that long-term sweep of things I started off talking about, you see the value we've created in the world and for the companies we support. And I think when we talk to one another, we can reinforce that as a matter of sort of the things we've done, but also look forward at the future of the things we will do. I mean, you can change laws, you can change culture, but you can't change the laws of physics. Okay, the world is getting warmer. Last year, extreme weather events driven by climate change exceeded 2% of the US GDP. 2% of the US GDP is a big number. And that is only going to continue. There are going to be implications across all industrial sectors that will have to be dealt with from a climate resilience and adaptation point of view. And so, it's about sort of like reaching out to one another, understanding what these trends are, understanding what we've been able to accomplish together, and seeing this future and trying to maybe insulate through our association ourselves from that emotional assault that tends to just, for whatever reason, follow this profession around.
That's a really great framing of all of that. I liked the kind of the altruism, but then we're always having to justify our altruism, which seems very unfair. And where do you go then, Tim? Or do you have any platforms or anything specifically you could suggest for, staying up to date on the positive news and the positive trends, or any platforms that you tap into to network with your fellow practitioners?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've talked about green biz, as one thing. I think that is one particular item, but there are many similar kinds of events, conferences. I used to be a board member of something called Net Impact, where it charged my batteries so much because all of those people were young and had their whole futures ahead of them and had made a decision that they wanted to work for good. And they all wanted to know how to do it. That's why I wrote my book, like, tell us how to do it. So, for me anyway, it's working with youth. I try to get involved with the universities. I do a lot of guest lecturing. I'm here in Pittsburgh, so we have Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, and they're always, I never have time, but they're always asking. And it's a fantastic, every time I do it, I like dread doing it. And then I feel high as a kite afterwards because, all these young people are like, yes, I'm going to do something great. So for me anyway, it's working with young people.
I love that. Yeah, getting the next generation, because they give us the energy, because they seem to kind of already get it just intrinsically about why this matters. And it's kind of the next wave of people that are going to be holding the flag. So getting that exposure, but then also imparting your knowledge and your wisdom to them I'm sure you see a lot of value and purpose in that. Is there anything you saw at GreenBiz in terms of kind of which companies are doing things that you thought, wow, this is innovative. We're still on this, it's not just about compliance. We're doing some really interesting work. I know you obviously can't talk about clients at BCG, but is there anything else you see in the wider corporate landscape or brand landscape that you think, yeah, let's keep following these leaders?
It's a great question. I went to one session that was on policy, which, couldn't be any hotter than it is right now as a battleground. And the panelists who were up there were eBay, Michelin, and Nestle. And these were three companies that, were speaking quite openly about their support of policies in the US government as it's currently construed that, advance climate action. And it was quite interesting to hear that, to see that, to understand how they're interfacing with policymakers in the current climate in the US anyway, and overseas. And so, you have to ask yourself, like, wow, how did they get that through legal? So, but they did, and they're managing to do that. So, for me, that was very inspiring. And I do think there are, to do anything publicly now is kind of an act of courage. And I think that there are companies, and it was in the chat, that are standing up and saying, what we said before is what we meant. And that will continue. And ultimately, they may be attacked in social media, as we've seen many times, but they're going to, just pay that price for the long-term gain.
Yeah, I think I think it's very brave, right? Of some of these companies stepping up and still advocating for policy change and not letting the system take over. But we need, those are the people that are the true saints, I think, the ones that are running the companies that are going to keep the flag waving for climate and our ESG agenda. So I'd love to open it up now, Tim, unless you have anything else you want to add before we open it up to wider open Q&A. Is there anything else you'd like to cover?
I think I've covered it. I again just wanted to commend everybody for the choices you've already made for, choosing this career path, doing good for others. It speaks to a certain inner altruism that, comes along with the slings and arrows that we've discussed already. And so having this kind of supportive conversation among peers who think the same way and have made the same choices is, to me, invaluable. So I do want to make this more of a discussion. I know there's a lot of questions piling up in the chat here, but let's see if we can open it up.
Great. Yeah, let's do. So John, do you want to ask your question? John Norwood. Hello, hello. Good to see you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great to see you. And Tim, thanks for being with us today. I'm in Iowa, so I'm curious, any specifics. You're in Pittsburgh, so I'm curious about the steel industry or other industries that you, what are they focused on in terms of the parts of the ESG landscape that are still important for companies to be pursuing?
Yeah. So just as a predicate, I mean, the first thing is we got to stop calling it ESG. Anytime you have a three-letter acronym, it's just so easy to attack. We should call it, it started off as corporate responsibility, really hard to be against that. Sustainability, also kind of tough to argue with. ESG, what's that? If you ask most of the people who are against it, they don't know. So, we've become our own worst enemy, and I forget where that term started, but if you really unpack it, there's so many issues under this broad umbrella that it's hard to answer your question. When I ran GRI, there were 33 topic-specific standards, 33 in the E, the S, and the G. So it goes from, our topic before, which was diversity, all the way through to health and safety and environment and how the board works. And it's just like, well, okay, what isn't it? It's everything. And so I do think that as we approach it that way, there are so many aspects that are bedrock that will, survive is not even the right word, that are just bedrock. That's how the company operates. So we have to de-average. We have to take these issues one at a time and look at them in their own merits and understand, does it still make sense? As you look at the steel industry in Pittsburgh, and by the way, I'm not here because I'm here for family, but it's just so interesting because this whole town was built on, this heavy industry, super polluting, and now has emerged as a, center of medical, educational, and technology. And yet, right over there is the U.S. Steel building that is largely going to be bought or was going to be bought by the Japanese. It's so interesting to see this evolution and then understand that with that comes the environmental conditions that had a role, not the sole role in that whole evolution that we just laid out. I think going forward, the issue with steel is going to be the carbon taxes, as I mentioned before, that will impact. It's the number one product on the CBAM Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism list that will go forward. And we at BCG have done some analysis, and the numbers are startling in terms of the dollars attached per ton of steel. And China's already reacting just to the threat of carbon taxes. So you're seeing a big cleanup in terms of the steel making in China, where most of it is done now. So it is quite interesting to see how these issues are, everything is entwined, everything's connected to one another. And that's certainly what we're seeing with the steel industry.
Super answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I'm wondering, just on the back of that, Tim, I think I use ESG just because it's easier now to conclude the environmental and the social. And I always feel like I feel like the social sometimes gets second fiddle, even though it was probably around before even the environmental, in essence, of corporate social responsibility back in the day. But how else can we kind of bring it all together that it has one framing? Would you call that corporate sustainability now, or how would you frame that?
We had this whole, word salad debate when I was at AMD, and we came up with corporate responsibility because it was corporate social responsibility. We said, well, it's much more than that.
That's too much.
Right. And then when you talk about the social, Shannon, good call out. We're all human beings, and everything to do with human beings is under that social header. And back to the question about steel, now that I am a Yinzer, a Pittsburghian living here, I can say this is the birthplace of the labor movement because of how people were treated poorly in the steel industry back in the day. And they fought and won for a weekend and overtime and stuff like that. Fast forward, when I joined Apple in the early 00s, like 06, my job was to straighten out Foxconn, labor and human rights, right in our grill again, so, and those issues are still with us, right? The issues of forced labor, child labor. Sadly, they have not gotten better. And they, I think, are vexing to many companies. And then back to policy, we're seeing the corporate due diligence directive, corporate sustainability due diligence directive out of Europe and other laws similar to that in Germany and other places. We have the Uyghur law, the conflict minerals law, et cetera, that policymakers are sort of saying, look, this is unacceptable to use corporate dollars to support these egregious acts in other countries, since now supply chains are global. It's a very important issue. And sometimes we sort of just, it's diversity. No, it's much more than that.
No, it is. I think that, and it gets lost somehow, I feel. And that's what I liked about ESG originally. And now it's just easier to shorthand. But yeah, I think you're right. It's corporate responsibility across the board, but it's also more than just corporate. I think that's the other problem with that term, but we won't go into that now. I'll let some of the other people ask their good questions. Let's do Joanne Hare. Joanne, you there? Unmute. All right.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for putting this together. This is brilliant. I was asking a question earlier, and I think, Tim, you got at it a little bit. I too am a consultant in strategy and management consulting. in sustainability with large corporates, right, globally. And for the last couple of years, we know that everything is constantly shifting. We don't have traction. Trying to help boards and executive teams see the power in actually operationalizing sustainability into their operations, right, and embedding it. So back to what you were talking about in terms of systems change and aligning organizations to just deliver on it, whatever we call it, right? But it's sustainability and corporate responsibility. And I was asking really where are you seeing traction for that uptake? And if you are, because I know BCG is more on the just strategy front end rather than the transformation, which connects into, execution.
Such a great question, Joanne. And that is the bulk of my work. It's the work I really love to do.
Me too.
And as the as the issue has gone from the fringe to the mainstream into things like, financial disclosure, we're seeing these strange bedfellows come crashing together. I talked about finance and sustainability. The finance people, they know about delivering financial reports. They don't know about adding climate into, what is
Exactly.
climate, and so some of the work we've done, some of the most satisfying work is to bring these folks together, some of the basics of roles, the RACI diagram and, competencies and capabilities and resourcing levels, and then IT and, building the entire management system with folks that haven't worked together before, and then bringing in the international element and the centralized versus decentralized element. It's all being driven though by policy. It's really interesting. I think many of these finance people would rather. It is. Let me stop there because there is kind of a difference. In Europe, I see the finance and the sustainability people arguing for a role. In the US, they're trying to throw the role at the other one. And so,
I see that too. Yeah.
but nonetheless, they have to work together, which I think is fascinating and fun.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. Catherine. Just remember to
unmute. Hi. Is that me? This Catherine? I don't know if there's other Catherines. Hi, Tim. Thanks for that conversation. I was just curious what you think maybe isn't getting enough attention. What are we not talking enough about in sustainability? Whether that's what the companies need to be focusing on or whether it's what the news needs to be focused on. I'd just love to hear maybe how we can be ahead of some things that haven't percolated up in the news yet.
Yeah, I think we always talk about the risks and less about the opportunities. I had, after the last time Shannon and I worked together, I went to the small startup called Persephone, which is the epitome of an opportunity. There are a bunch of software companies that started up to serve the market we were just discussing. And even in big companies, there are opportunities that are being created by the changing world around us. And many times we just sort of ignore that piece, like how can we do good and do well? That piece is really exciting to me. Even in the sort of risk and resilience piece, adaptation piece, if you flip the script, instead of looking at the world as, a bunch of risks, and you look at it as a bunch of opportunities, and how do you apply your core competencies to the changes we're seeing in the world, then it changes everything. And I think it starts to become more interesting to a broader set of people who might have ignored this before as being like, yeah, that's kind of the woke stuff, to, that could be interesting. So to me, it's about flipping the script and looking at opportunity.
Tracy had a question about your career journey, and would love to turn it over to Tracy to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I was very curious about if you could share more about your career journey. And in particular, you mentioned sort of always needing to justify your sort of sustainability existence at a company. So I was curious if there were ever any times where you felt that doing that justification at a company wasn't worth it. Were there any times you felt stuck in your career, and how did you get yourself unstuck?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there is the emotional roller coaster. We talked about this before of, trying to do good and having those days of elation where you feel like you've done it. And then those, being questioned about your existence. For me, I have always made every career choice, and there's been a few, based on impact as the first thing. And then secondly, about, family and location and salary and all that stuff. But the first thing was like, where can I make more of a difference? And so that's always led my choices. And, you know, to be really open, there have been times where I was stuck or I found the need to change. You know, things weren't exactly going the way I wanted them to. The one I'll mention to you is, you know, when I reached out to Shannon the first time, I was at AMD, great company. I definitely left too early. Thank you, Shannon, because they started to make all this money after I left. Not a maybe a coincidence, I don't know. But you know, I was like doing the same thing year over year over year, and it just didn't feel like we were doing that much, you know. And so that impact thing was going off in my brain. I wanted to do something that had more impact for the world, and you know, ended up at GRI in the Netherlands. So it was pretty awesome in many ways, but it did take a lot of thought, a lot of discussion. It gets very personal, right? About your ambitions and your family and everything you're doing with your life. And so that's where I think a good coach really comes into play, because again, it goes from that emotional into the tactical, which is exactly what we did, right, Shannon, when we went to from AMD to GRI.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that enough, Tracy, on that one? Yeah, great. Thank you for that final question, because I think it's good to have a personal perspective too, right? From other mentors and leaders in this space. And as Tim, you said, you like working with the youth. So I appreciate that you are always out there helping those of us that have questions and are on our journeys. And you've always been really a fantastic support to many of us as we came up in our careers as well in this space. So thank you to all that you do, and thank you for making time for us today.